Hi, I'm Ashley with Campbell. Thanks for investing your time to help your community be a great place to live. Before you watch the video, make sure to click the subscribe button so that we can help you make educated decisions as a board member.
All right, welcome everyone. My name is Ashley over at Campbell Property Management, and this is our House Bill 913 and SIRS All You Need to Know webinar. For those of you not as familiar with Campbell, we have been in business since 1953, and we do currently manage over 450 community associations from Miami-Dade all the way through Central Florida, including Orlando and Daytona. We love to bring free education to board members and property managers in the form of our blog, Florida Association News, and also through these webinars. You can always access our past and upcoming webinars at campbellevents.org. And with that, I am going to go ahead and turn it over to Will to get us started.
Hey, everybody. Good afternoon. Thanks, Ashley. And thank you to Campbell Management for putting this on and giving me this opportunity. We've done a lot of classes together over the years. Some of you guys out there in the audience may have attended some of those. So welcome back. This is going to be a little bit different from some of our normal classes. I guess I should say, in the sense that this is not a class. This is not a continuing education opportunity. This is just for information's sake. It's going to be a great session for condo and co-op board members and managers in particular. Those of you guys who are representing HOAs, thank you for being here. But unless you have some interest in House Bill 913 and structural integrity reserve studies, today may not be the most informative for you guys. But we're going to try to make this a great session. So I've got a shorter presentation than I normally give. This is only about 20 something slides. So I'm going to try to get through it in maybe 30, 40 minutes at most. And then we'll open up the floor to the Q&A. So this is really for you guys, a great opportunity to learn a little bit about structural integrity reserve studies and what has changed this year. So let me get through the presentation. We'll run through all the slides, and then we'll open it up for Q&A at the end. But certainly along the way, if you want to pop in a question, you can use that Q&A button down at the bottom of your Zoom taskbar. So let me go ahead and share my screen and we'll get started in just a second here. Okay, so you guys should be now seeing, there it goes, kind of a green backdrop with our company logo on it. So
it looks good.
Perfect. Okay, great. In that case, let me grab my controls. Move this over here. All right, I like to turn off my video while I'm doing this, but I'll put the video back on just at the end. So here we go. Okay, should be good. All right, so hello again. Thanks everybody for joining us today. Ashley already did a great job getting all the housekeeping type of stuff out of the way. So yeah, just as a reminder, we're going to be sending out copies of the presentation along with the recording. And what I'd also like to do, Ashley, I'm going to send you my copy of House Bill 913, because as we're going to talk about, I've got a lot of references that I'm going to include on some of these slides to the text of the bill itself. So let's make sure that when we send out the follow-up email, that we include that. It's like a 191-page PDF. So there's no way I'm going to get into all of the detail that's covered in the bill, but what I do have today is this focus on the things that have changed this year as of July 1st. Okay, let's see. I think that's enough on that for now. Let me just kind of talk a little bit about myself and our company in a little bit more detail. My name is Will Simons. I'm the president of the Florida office for Association Reserves. I've been with the company going back to 2008, so it'll be 18 years for me next spring. In that time, I've completed and overseen more than 5,000 reserve studies between myself and my staff. The RS after my name stands for Reserve Specialist. That's an industry-specific credential that is only awarded to people who have demonstrated their experience and expertise in preparing reserve studies. You guys may be familiar, that designation comes from CAI, the Community Associations Institute. I do want to point out right here at the beginning, and I'll reiterate this at the end, I am not an attorney. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about the statute, talking about some of the requirements and things that have changed, but this is not legal advice. So if you're not quite sure what might apply in your situation, I would definitely encourage you to talk with your legal counsel and make sure that you are, abiding by your own governing documents and things like that. Also, I want to point out, here we are, middle of October. This bill, the House Bill 913 that I'll be talking about, was only signed into law a couple of months ago, July 1st. So we have not even been through one full year, not even really one budget cycle with this information. So if you happen to be watching this at some point in the future, double check everything. Some things might have changed. It's very much expected that after the first of the year, the Florida legislature is going to get back together again and be working on what people are already calling Condo 5.0, which could be even further iterations and changes from what we have now. So it's possible some things may have changed, but this is, as far as we know it, hopefully state-of-the-art information. So, and by the way, I just want to say thanks for all those of you guys. I know, being that it's the middle of October, especially for you managers, this is crunch time. This is budget season. So we certainly appreciate you guys taking the time out to be with us today. So, all right, just a little bit more about the company if you're not familiar with us. These are some of the types of properties we work with, very broad range of client types, everything from private schools and church facilities to large-scale master associations, golf and country clubs, and of course, really the subject of today's topic, condos, which is really all types of condos, everything from 50, 60-story high rises all the way down to 2 to 3 story garden style, apartment style condos, and certainly HOAs as well. So if we haven't worked together before, let me tell you, our company is the oldest and largest reserve study provider in the United States. We've been in business now since 1986, and we've completed, I can actually update this now, we just crossed over 100,000. So we just finished, within the last month or so, our 100,000th reserve study. All different types of properties all around the world, including myself. We have a total of 25 people on our Florida staff, which represents a very wide variety of technical backgrounds. We've got a lot of people with various engineering backgrounds, but also architecture, construction management, business, and accounting. As of now, we've got 10 of us that have earned the reserve specialist credential, and several more staff hoping to qualify for that as early as first half of next year. We've been very fortunate over the years. I want to say thank you to those that have voted for us. We've been a Reader's Choice Award winner with the Florida Community Association Journal for the last 12 years in a row. And yeah, that's really about it. I'll just tease our website is reservestudy.com. At the end of the presentation, I'll have my email address up on screen. I think Ashley will send that out as well. But that's wsimons@reservestudy.com. Okay. Here we go. So the first thing that I want to do before we talk about anything that has changed this year is to do this fairly quick recap on the existing requirements. So hopefully most of you guys out there in the audience will be at least somewhat familiar with the things that have gone on in the last couple of years. I've done similar presentations in the past talking about the previous versions and previous iterations of the SIRS requirements. And I should probably define that. So a SIRS, S-I-R-S, is a structural integrity reserve study. Okay, so some of you guys might have seen previous presentations we've done. About 2 years ago, I did one where I used this kind of book report format, as a who, what, when, where, and why sort of framework. And of course, I think we all know the why in this case, where this all started was with the tragic collapse of the Champlain Tower South building, June of 2021, so a little over 4 years ago now. Sadly, I think that these days that's becoming a little bit of a faded memory for some people, but I think we owe it to the 98 people who lost their lives to remember why these things exist. Why has so much changed in that time? And try to remember that there's a very important reasoning behind any of these new legislative requirements. All right. So if we go back to 2022, that's when we had the first iteration of this legislative response to the tower collapse. That was in the spring of 2022. We had Senate Bill 4D. So if you remember, that was the first time the Florida legislature introduced the concept of what we now call a SIRS, right? That Structural Integrity Reserve Study. The biggest major changes to that first requirement then took place in 2023 with Senate Bill 154. Those of you might remember that bill would recall that when the requirements were originally created, they included some things that kind of didn't make sense. Things like building foundations that just on paper just didn't really make a lot of logical sense to people. So in 2023, when they introduced Senate Bill 154, they trimmed down and kind of clarified some of the physical requirements for things that belong in a SIRS. But that was also when the types of providers of a SIRS were expanded to include reserve specialists and professional reserve analysts. So I believe beginning in 2023, that's when you started to see really the start of this major demand period that continued through the rest of 23 and on into 2024. So in 2024, that's when we had House Bill 1021. That was the inclusion of some additional reporting requirements and other education requirements for board members. But in 2024, there was no major overhaul to anything related specifically to the SIRS. Okay, that brings us now to the present day, 2025. House Bill 913, that was actually originally passed by the Florida legislature earlier in the spring of this year, signed into law by the governor July 1st. And like I said, I don't think we're done yet. Okay, we're now less than 3 months away from the end of the year, and the legislature is already workshopping and talking and kind of discussing plans for next session, which will begin in January. It's going to go from January to March of next year, and that's when all the legislative action really kicks in. So we'll see what happens soon, but rest assured, if things do change in a big way, we will bring that news back to you guys and publicize whatever those changes are going to be. So just, if this is the first time you're hearing me or hearing anybody talk about a SIRS, right? Let's just refresh on the definition there. And I'm not necessarily going to read the whole thing, right? You guys will have copies of these slides, so you don't feel like you need to be taking notes, right? But let's just take this paragraph here on the screen. This is what a SIRS is defined as in the Florida statutes. Now, the point I want to make is if you take out the words structural integrity, right, from the first line in this text right here, what you're left with is pretty much the classic definition of a reserve study. Okay, it's a physical analysis of a property based on a visual inspection, which is then used to create a financial analysis that that property can use to make sure that it is forecasting and budgeting for major projects. Okay, so I've been using this kind of clarifying point a lot, that this is not a completely new concept, right? Reserve studies have been around for decades. Adding in the words structural integrity, I think, was a nod to the kind of events that took place in 2021, focusing on the most critical parts of a building. But a reserve study is very broad in nature. It includes lots and lots of things that go beyond just the structural integrity of a property. Okay, this here is the listing of components that are specifically stated in statute. And for reference, I'll just run through the list. Okay, so some of these are pretty self-explanatory, roof replacement. Then we go into structure and the statute here, 627.706. That's going to define your primary structural members and primary structural systems as structural elements designed to provide support and stability for the vertical or lateral loads of the overall structure. And a primary structural system is just an assemblage of those structural members. Okay, so a lot of people ask me, well, how does this actually work in practice, right? Are we budgeting to replace the bones of our building? And the answer typically is no, right? Most of the time, buildings, especially coastal buildings, concrete block frame buildings, experience some amount of concrete restoration on a regular basis. And so typically what you're going to get in a SIRS is going to be some recommendation, some allowance for mitigating that, for repairing concrete. Typically, every time you paint and waterproof your building is the best opportunity to do that kind of concrete work. So when we talk about a structure, typically that's what we're meaning is some allowance for a percentage of the total kind of overall repairs. Okay, we then move on to fireproofing and fire protection systems. These are going to be your fire alarm systems, your smoke detectors, your control panel, your notification devices, all of that. but also your fire sprinkler systems. If you've got a BDA system, things like that can be included there as well. We've got plumbing, electrical. These are very broadly defined. If you notice, that's all it says is plumbing. So it's kind of up to the discretion of the provider to define, what are the common area plumbing obligations? What can you consider in terms of repairs or replacements long term that might need to be in there? Kind of same goes with electrical. This is not meant to be replacing every single light fixture and every single, power outlet in a building, but it's for major kind of not structural, major infrastructure electrical repairs, I would say. Waterproofing and exterior painting, very critical to protecting your structure. So that's going to be painting your building, but that can also be resurfacing or waterproofing balcony decks, planter decks, I should say plaza decks, something like an elevated pool deck, emptying out planters that are in an elevated position, right? Anything that's keeping water out of the building can be considered under letter F here. Windows and exterior doors, I want to clarify, this is only windows and doors that are the association's responsibility to replace. Probably 99% of the time, condo or co-op documents dictate that the individual owner is responsible for their own windows and doors at their unit. So those are not what we're talking about here, but windows and doors that are in common areas, at amenities, at lobbies, things like that, those would be what we consider under G here. And then you've got any other item that has a cost greater than now $25,000. It used to be $10,000. Increase that to $25,000. And the failure to replace or maintain that item could negatively affect something else on this list. So my best example of that would be something like the balcony railings on a balcony, right? Typically about every 4 feet, you're going to have a metal post that is embedded or mechanically attached to the concrete slab of the balcony. And if those are not maintained, if those are not waterproofed, those can be a place where water gets into the slab and causes damage to the structure. So by that definition, we would treat the railings as a SIRS component, because if you fail to maintain or replace them, they could affect the structure of the building. Okay, so kind of a little bit of a logical test we need to apply there on letter H. Okay, otherwise, most of the details for a SIRS have not changed. Okay, we're still talking about all properties throughout Florida. Specifically, we're talking condos and co-ops that are 3 or more, and I should add in the word habitable stories in height. I believe that was another change this year. There are some exemptions for buildings that are very small. So if you have, I believe, 4 or less units per building, then you may be exempt from the SIRS requirement. Okay, it still is based on a visual inspection. Once that document is completed, you have to report that to the DBPR and provide that to your members within 45 days. So actually none of that really is very different from last year. Some of you guys may have seen now the DBPR has updated their online reporting site. They're asking for more information from condos these days. Every year, you're going to have to renew your information for board member contacts, management contacts, things like that. And also use that portal to confirm that you've completed your SIRS, but also maybe your milestone inspection if you're required for that as well. Okay, so that's what we had up until now. Now I want to talk about what has changed. Okay, so again, this is an ongoing process by the Florida legislature to fine tune these requirements to make them more practical, hopefully make them more realistic to attain for most properties out there. So the first and foremost thing I'm going to talk about is the deadline extension. But before I do that, I want to highlight this section down here at the bottom. I kind of touched on this in the intro. But where you see this word source, and then you've got a document with a page number and line numbers, this is what we're going to send out as part of the follow-up here. It's that 190 something page copy of House Bill 913. And what I'm doing here is I'm trying to show where I got this information from. So when you open that attachment, you'll go to this page number and these line numbers. On the left-hand side of the page, you're going to see line numbers. Literally every line in the document has a number. So these are going to direct you exactly to, the written, confirmation of what we're talking about here. So just if you want to go dig into this a little deeper, that can be your homework assignment. But Anyways, first thing to highlight is that the deadline for obtaining the SIRS has now been extended to December 31st of this year. So that is what, 10-ish weeks away now. Up until earlier this year, the original requirement was December 31st of 2024. Now, I think that was kind of a lofty goal, considering the amount of properties in Florida that are subject to these requirements. The reality is that what we saw is that by the end of 2024, end of last year, relatively small fraction, it was maybe about a quarter to a third of properties had definitively met the deadline and reported to the DBPR that they had completed the requirement. So looking ahead now to the end of this year, which is really not that far away, I still think there will be quite a few properties that will have not met even this new deadline either. But I want to point something out. Along with the deadline change, right? That was an extension on the part of the state to give everybody a little bit more time. There are also some additional powers of enforcement that were put into this year's bill. So if you miss the new deadline, right, there may be some additional consequences that I think are going to be very important. I'll get to those right at the end of the talk today. Okay. There was a subtle but I think important change that was made this year regarding who is actually qualified to prepare a SIRS. So in prior years, prior versions of the bill, the text actually said that any person qualified could actually prepare the document, but that the visual inspection of the building, of the project, had to be performed or verified by an engineer or an architect or a reserve specialist or a PRA, a professional reserve analyst. In this year's bill, they crossed out this language right here. So it no longer is any person qualified, because that could have opened the door for, say, a CPA, a property manager, an attorney, a board member, maybe trying to do their own SIRS as long as the inspection was done by one of these folks. That is no longer the case. I don't think that was happening very much, but maybe there were some instances where somebody was trying to take this on themselves, basing their recommendations off of the visual inspection, no longer allowed. Okay. Another big change that happened this year was the addition of some new language that is intended to require more transparency and to prevent conflicts of interest. So to be specific, that means that design professionals, such as an engineer or an architect, somebody who might have some other interest in a property, such as bidding on a concrete for something like concrete restoration or painting, as an example, they would now actually have to disclose that in writing before they submitted a proposal for a SIRS. Now, I can tell you that is the specific result of some unfortunate circumstances where you had providers of SIRS for buildings who were completing those studies, which meant providing opinions on the conditions of the property, and then changing hats and turning around and offering to be the ones to then conduct those repairs. Okay, I heard some anecdotal stories of some providers using a $5,000 SIRS report as the springboard or the entree to a project management fee that was maybe worth many times that. So to be clear, that's not prohibited, right? You can have an engineer who also does structural engineering work or oversees concrete restoration and would like to be working with the association for that work as well. All they would now have to do is just disclose that in writing, so the board knows that you're kind of placing a lot of responsibility in that one person or that one firm. All right, I can tell you from having spoken with the legislators themselves a lot early part of this year is that this year's focus was on financial flexibility and on easing the burden of cost on residents. Okay, that was the main goal of this year's legislation, and that's a good thing. If you haven't felt it yourself, I'm sure many of you guys have at least heard of some of the anxiety and the frustration that has come along these last couple of years about making some what feel like big budgetary increases in a very short amount of time. So this is what they try to do to fix that. As I say on the screen here, loans, lines of credit, and special assessments can now be incorporated into a SIRS and treated as part of the funding plan. Okay, there is a specific caveat to that though. The funding from those sources, okay, and I'll just call them alternative funding sources, has to be immediately available to the board without further approval of the members. So for example, that doesn't mean that a board can say, a year from now, we plan to take out a loan for a project. Okay, unless it already has been done, they've secured that money, those funds are available, then they can use that in their funding plan. Otherwise, they cannot. Okay, so if they've got that money or if they have already passed and begun to collect a special assessment, then the provider of the SIRS can take that into account. And what we would do in that case is we would then show any projects that are going to be restored or paid for using those funds will be, given a full life expectancy again. Imagine turning the hourglass over and now all the sand is back in the top. Okay, that's what we do. If you tell us, hey, we've got a special assessment or we've got a loan and we're going to use it to replace our roof, great. We're going to reset the lifespan on your roof so that with regard to your budget, you're still funding reserves, but it's for a project that is now, maybe 20 years from now. Okay, the bottom line is that when we do that, hopefully you can reduce the budgetary need for reserves on the, ongoing monthly basis if you can reflect that you've got these alternative funds that will be available first and will be used for those projects. Okay, another one where I've got kind of a lot of text on the screen here, so please feel free to read this in detail on your own time. The short summary, though, is that if you are in a property that has completed a milestone inspection within the last 2 years, and if that milestone inspection uncovered some substantial repairs that need to be dealt with right away, you may actually pause your reserve funding for the next 2 budgets. Now, that will only apply to budgets adopted before the end of 2028, but hopefully that's some welcome relief for properties out there that have gone through a milestone and discovered they've got a lot of repairs to deal with right away. Okay, along with that is that when that association has to then resume their reserve funding after the pause, they do have to have a new SIRS done to show what their updated reserve requirements would be. Okay, so if that applies to you, if you're in an older building that has just gone through this process, maybe you're working through those concrete repairs now, you might want to pay attention to this. You can take advantage of this for the next 2 years, not for any budget after the end of 2028, but for the next couple of years. If you get the majority of your owners to vote on it, then you can pause reserve funding. That might be a big help to you. Okay, along with this, continuing theme of financial relief. Okay, one of the biggest reasons, one of the biggest counter arguments we've heard over the years against funding reserves is that people have felt like the return on those funds when they're just sitting in the association's bank account is pretty low compared to what they might be able to get if they were just investing money on their own and paying a special assessment if they have to. Okay, the problem with that argument is that when those owners have money locked up in their own investment portfolios, it's never going to make it back to the association, right? If they pass away or move away, that money never goes back to the association. Okay, so this new language has been added now to allow boards of directors to be a little bit more creative and aggressive with how they invest their reserve money. Typically, that's always going to be sitting in very boring accounts like CDs or money market accounts, not getting the same returns as the wider economy. But this new language in House Bill 913 is meant to allow associations to make, quote, prudent investment decisions that hopefully will get a better return. This is very new. We just had lunch with a banker earlier this week to kind of just see, hey, have you guys started to get any interest in this? Are associations asking you about this? And the answer was not really, not yet. So we'll see how this plays out over time. I'm hopeful that it's a good thing. I hope that this benefits associations. They can get a better return on their funds, but I would definitely suggest if you're considering this, highly, highly recommend working with some professional advisors, making sure that when you're making these investments, the most important thing for me would be to make sure your money is going to be liquid at the time you need it. So for example, if you've got a lot of reserve obligations in the next 3 to 5 years, you wouldn't want to invest in something that's very risky that could leave you severely underfunded right when the project comes along. Now, if you're in a newer property and most of your reserve expenses are, say, 10 to 15 years or more into the future, to me, I think that allows you to take a little bit more risk. You have greater time to recover if something goes wrong. But again, we're not investment advisors ourselves. If you are considering that, seek out those people and tread carefully would be my advice. Okay. Another thing that changed in this year's legislation has to do with the requirement to update your SIRS. So up until this point, the legislative requirements called for updating the plan at least once every 10 years. But as of now, there are some additional circumstances that would require an update to be performed. So as we talked about a few slides ago, loans and lines of credit and special assessments can be part of your funding plan now as well. But anytime those are going to be used, the SIRS would have to be updated to reflect that those funds are now available. Okay. In addition, and I would say this may be very relevant for properties this year specifically in 2025, your SIRS has to be updated before any budget is passed in which the funding of reserves does not align with the most recent SIRS. Okay, so let me spell that out. For example, many associations last year took advantage of the final opportunity to have their membership vote to waive or partially fund reserves, even for their structural assets. Now, that was perfectly legal to do at that time last year. But if you did that, that would mean that your funding plan in the SIRS from last year is no longer applicable. Okay, the reason is that those studies would have included a funding amount for 2025, which was not collected, right? If they waived that or did less than what was called for, you're not starting in the same position. Okay, the amount of money that would have been projected to be on hand in 2026 is no longer going to be correct. So it's not possible for this next year's budget to be in alignment with the last one if you didn't follow that plan. Let me explain this a different way. Let's say if I was telling you how long it would take you to drive from Miami to Jacksonville. Okay, I told you to leave at a specific time and drive a certain speed. And if we had a clear understanding of how much traffic there would be, then we could reasonably predict when you would arrive. But let's say you ignored that advice and you started a few hours late. Okay, well, if that's the case, you're not going to be in alignment with the plan that we came up with. You're not ending up at the same place at the same time. That would mean we'd have to come up with a new plan based on the fact that you started later. Okay, same goes for reserve funding. If you wait a while, if you wait, in some properties that are doing this for the very first time, you've got a lot more to do to catch up to where you should be. Okay, just a couple more slides here. I do see some questions in the Q&A, so please feel free to continue adding those, and we'll run through those in maybe the next 5-10 minutes, but a couple of other things to document here. Another nice thing in this year's bill is that they specifically defined the term baseline funding. Now, just to let you know, this term has been in existence for quite a long time. It's been part of reserve study standards through CAI going back to the late 90s. So this, to me, is just a nice way of making things consistent between Florida statutes and our existing industry terminology. But if you're not familiar with what that means, baseline funding means that you're designing a funding plan that makes sure you never completely run out of money. Okay? Each year as cash goes in and cash goes out of the reserve account, you have to make sure that at the very least you're staying above zero. That's what baseline funding means. So in this case, the technical requirement hasn't actually changed. This was actually always the law in Florida. When you have pooled reserves, the minimum amount of money you need to put aside is that which keeps you above zero. What we're doing now is just calling that by its proper name. That is called baseline funding. Okay, with regard to the reporting requirements, there's really only one significant change to talk about. The first two things on this list were already in existence. Okay, so as of last year, we already had a requirement to distribute a copy of the completed SIRS within 45 days of receiving it and also reporting that to the DBPR. The only additional requirement this year that's above and beyond that is that now an officer or a director of the association must sign an affidavit acknowledging receipt that has been delivered. So that's a little bit more of a strict legal requirement certifying that has been completed. Now we're getting clients asking for guidance on how to do that. So at this point in time, there is no state, universal affidavit form that has been established, but we are working on that. In fact, later this afternoon, I'm going to be in a task force meeting with the DBPR, and one of our things that we're working on is a standardized reporting form for the SIRS, and a standardized affidavit. So hopefully we'll get that done soon. I would like to say hopefully by the end of this year, so that going forward, you'll know exactly how to do that. But in the meantime, what I would tell you is talk with your attorney, see if they can draft a pretty basic affidavit, and that should satisfy the requirement for now. Okay, so the last, and I think maybe most important aspect of the changes that took place this year is what I want to talk about now. So I kind of touched on this earlier, but at the end of last year, the data provided by the DBPR showed that only about a quarter to a third of properties had completed their SIRS, right? It was something like 4,000 and change buildings as of, early part of this year did it. Part of the reason I'm saying between a quarter and a third is because people don't actually know how many condos and co-ops there are in Florida that are 3 stories and above. So that's another challenge that DBPR is working on now, is just establish the size of the sample, right? How many buildings are there out there? But we know that it's going to be, my guess would be something like anywhere from 15 to 20,000 associations. Okay, so if only 4,000 and change got it done, even if we're very generous on, rounding down that total number, the majority of buildings did not meet the requirement. Okay, so that's part of the reason why they extended this deadline. But going forward, in exchange for the extended deadline and these other steps they've used to make this more financially, practical for associations, the DBPR also now has some expanded powers to enforce compliance with the statute. Okay, so I want to make a couple of things clear. It was already true as of last year and prior years that if an association willfully and knowingly failed to meet the requirement, that the board of directors could be found to be in breach of their fiduciary duties. Okay, so that's kind of this top part here. This was already in existence. And as we've talked about before, when you're in breach of fiduciary duty, a bunch of other things can happen. First of all, directors and officers coverage may not protect you personally from liability as a board member. You can also be dropped by an insurance company. We've heard anecdotal stories now of associations having a hard time getting lending, or buyers being able to qualify for mortgages in those buildings, right? So being out of compliance with the statute can have a bunch of indirect consequences. But now, okay, this is where I'm getting into the bottom paragraph here. Now the DBPR has been given this additional authority to impose fines of up to $5,000, which in some cases could be charged individually to board members. Okay, so again, individually, that is not to the association, that is to the person. Okay, in addition to that, those board members, those individuals could possibly be removed from their position as a board member and prohibited from rejoining the board for a period of time. Okay, so I think that's the stick here, right? The carrots being extended deadline, a little bit more flexibility on the financial side of things, but they are very strict about getting this done. Okay, so if you're a board member out there, or if you work with board members, I think it's very, very important to highlight these new requirements and make sure that you're doing everything you can to stay in compliance out there. And again, like we said, the source material is here, page numbers and line numbers. Encourage everybody to dig into that. Just really make sure that you understand what your position your association is in, what you need to do in terms of reporting, signing the affidavit, just checking all the right boxes to complete this requirement. So that is basically it. So I see we've got a healthy number of questions here. I'm going to turn my camera back on. I'll start going through this list, and Ashley, if you want to help me out with maybe just scanning over if there's anything that we've already covered in terms of housekeeping stuff, we can kind of move through those, but we'll just go down the list here in a second. I think it looks like Ashley also just launched a poll. Do you want to tell everybody what to do there?
Yeah. So in case anybody does want to jump off, because the presentation is complete, you don't want to stand for the Q&A, please go ahead and take that survey, the poll for us. We really appreciate it. Love to get your feedback. We mentioned it. I will be emailing out this presentation, the video recording, and then also Will's contact information after. So stay tuned for that. It will come out later today via email. But yeah, that's it for my housekeeping stuff. So Will, if we want to run through those questions.
Cool. Yeah, I'm just gonna go from the top down.
Perfect.
And if any of these are really like hyper specific to a particular association or their circumstances, I might have to skip over that just because we don't have all the information we would need, but I'll try to get through these as best we can. So here we go. Diana's question, can SIRS and general reserves be kept in one bank account? If so, how should the association report what the balances in each should be? So my understanding of this, and I've talked with CPAs about this, is that I think legally speaking, all of your reserves for your structural and non-structural assets could be kept in one bank account. However, they need to be separated on your balance sheet and shown accordingly, right? So if you've got, $2 million total of reserve funding, but $1.5 million is structural reserves and 500,000 is non-structural, you would need to show those separate amounts on your balance sheet and report it that way. I would happily defer to a CPA for a better answer on this, but I do believe they can be kept in one bank account. Now, should they be? Personally, I think it's a lot easier to separate. So nowadays you can have two pools of reserve funds. You can have your structural pool of funds and then your non-structural pool of funds. And I think it would be much cleaner and simpler to have two separate accounts, but that may be more challenging to do for some associations for some reason. All right. Andrea's question, can you use funds from pooled reserves for SIRS items if we are doing a project and the SIRS cumulative balance is not sufficient for project costs? So I think what you're asking there when you say pooled reserves, I'm guessing maybe that's your non-structural reserves, things like reserve money for elevators and air conditioning systems and parking lots and stuff like that. So if the total of your SIRS reserve balance is not enough to pay for a SIRS asset, something like a roof or painting the building, then typically, yes, you can use money from your non-structural reserves to pay for your structural reserves. It does not go the other way. So if you want to do a big lobby renovation project, you're not allowed to use structural reserve money for that. So your individual circumstances may require you to take money from the non-structural side, and if that's necessary, I don't think there's really any prohibition against that, but not the other way around. Okay, Michael's question, is there any process for replacing one reserve study with another? Yeah, that happens all the time. You may do a study with one company and decide that, it didn't work for you for whatever reason. So you could hire a different one to come in and replace that or update it. Maybe there's some valuable information in the prior one, and you want to use maybe the component quantities from your first one used in the second. So yeah, that does happen all the time. It's usually, I would say, unlikely to have two different studies done within the same fiscal year, but absolutely possible to move on and start with a new provider. Elizabeth's question, when does the elevator count towards the SIRS? Never. Elevators are not considered a structural reserve component. They're still very, very important. They are defined as a reserve asset under Statute 718, which says roofing, painting, and pavement resurfacing, and any other item costing more than $25,000. So by that definition, I would say absolutely elevators are reserve components, but they are not listed in the SIRS requirement. Okay, Joe's question, unit exterior doors and windows, why are they left up to the owners? They're part of the waterproofing of the building and impact the structure. 4D, move them to the association, and 154, move them back to the owners. So going back to 4D, it actually did not make them mandatory to fund if it was the owner's responsibility. If you go back to 4D, the fine print in there said that it was subject to association responsibility. So it goes back to the governing documents. We begin there. If your governing documents state that the owners are responsible for replacement of their windows and doors, that they bear that cost themselves, full stop, that's why they're not in the SIRS. It would only be exterior doors and windows that are in common area responsibility. Now, if the association is responsible for all windows and doors, then by all means, we need to include all of them there. But that is kind of a prerequisite. Even before that slide I had that listed the SIRS requirements we're still talking only about things that are the associations. Okay. Nadine says, I missed what was said that needs to be reported to the DBPR within 45 days. Could you please reiterate that? Yeah, so once you've got your SIRS from your provider, within 45 days, you need to go online to the DBPR's website. And maybe this is another thing we can include in the follow-up email is a link to that site. They have instructions about how to do this. But it basically just needs to be that you go online, you answer some questions about the association, you identify who the provider was. I actually can't recall at the moment if they're asking you to upload a copy of that. I know they did that previously, but it's basically just, hey, we're out here, we got this done, and that's it. So it's a fairly simple process. Your provider can probably help you with that, but that has to be done within 45 days of receiving the SIRS. Oh, and also notifying your owners that that was done. Okay, let's see. Craig, your question is getting a little specific to your situation, but I'll try to shed some light on it. It says regarding the SIRS covering exterior windows and doors, our documents do not specifically state responsibility. The association received a legal opinion that windows are the responsibility of the association and doors, including sliding doors, are that of the owner. Well, then that's it. If that's your legal opinion, I would go with that. So now you're going to put your windows, all of the windows in the building in your SIRS. You can leave out your your doors and sliding glass doors. Okay, let's say David's question. What has prevented associations from continuing to waive or underfund reserves? This is why and how people will still vote to not fund reserves properly. So that is no longer allowed, right? So this year, beginning in 2025 and beyond, the membership of an association no longer has the right to vote to partially fund or to waive reserves. You've got to do at least baseline funding for those structural components. For your non-structural components, everything else, the membership can still vote not to fund those things up to at least baseline, but it requires a 51% vote of the membership to carry that. So the state is now preventing associations from ignoring their responsibilities for their most critical assets, still giving them the option on your non-structural components, but that has become harder to do as well. Okay, Craig, another question says regarding balconies and railings, our documents say these are the responsibility of the owners. Okay, we're having water intrusion issues in balcony ceilings caused by various waterproofing issues with tiling on the balcony floors above. Is the association responsible for the balcony floors and sliding doors? On that one, I'd have to look at your documents or you'd have to work with your attorney to get clarification on that. A lot of the time, what it says is that the floor covering is the owner's responsibility. So the tile would be the owner, but the waterproofing and certainly the structural slab of the balcony is still the association. So if there's no waterproofing beneath those tiles, then usually what happens is the association can compel the owner to remove all the tiles. The association pays to properly repair and waterproof the balcony slab, the structure. Then the owner may be allowed to put back their own tile. So that's pretty common. Your case maybe sounds like something you want to look into. We're talking with your attorney, going through those docs and being very, very specific about what element of the balcony belongs to each entity. Let's see. Is there any movement to including, this is Bruce's question, is there any movement to including elevators in the SIRS asset class? Senator Jason Pizzo thinks this is a good idea. I think it's a great idea to fund reserves for elevators. No question about that. Whether or not there's any movement or idea about adding those to the SIRS list, I have not heard that. It's possible they may add that during this year's legislative session, but up until now, it's been considered, but has not been added. I do think it's a critical element for buildings. It would be foolish not to reserve money for your elevators. Let me be clear about that. But I don't know that it's going to be listed among the SIRS requirements specifically. Let's see, Stephen Taylor says, will questions we submitted with the registration be answered? Stephen, I'm not sure. I guess best thing to do would be to repost your question here. I don't know if those are going to be answered by email or some other capacity. I don't think I've seen those yet. So if you're not sure, go ahead and ask the question again here. Thank you. Okay. Let's see. Bruce asks, how does the reporting requirements for reserve studies parallel the financial statement reporting standards? Are there any industry reporting standards with regard to the reserve report, client engagement letter, and client representation letter? I don't know the answer to that, unfortunately. I don't know that there's intended to be any parallel with other types of financial reporting. What we're working on right now with the state is a standardized form that identifies kind of the basics about the SIRS, who did it, what fiscal year does it cover, how much money is on hand, what are the assets included. I don't think it's going to be held to any other, parallel standards for anybody else. Okay, John's question. If a property is no longer required to perform a SIRS, do the future reserves need to be aligned with the SIRS that has been performed prior to the changes in regulations? Okay, so that's an interesting one. I'm thinking maybe you have a building that is four units or less per building, or maybe it's fewer than 3 habitable stories. Maybe you were previously required to do the SIRS and now you're not. I don't think that you were any longer bound to those requirements. Would it be a good idea to continue along that path? I would say probably yes. These are good standards for a reason, but I don't think you're legally obligated if your building is now, for whatever reason, no longer obligated to do it. Okay, let's see. Craig's question, we postponed a waterproofing project due to installation issues with the first phase. We will close 2025 with a higher amount in the reserves budget. Do we need to redo our SIRS in 2026? I would say yes for a couple of reasons. I mean, technically, I think yes, because you're no longer in alignment with your prior SIRS. So if your physical or financial circumstances have changed, significantly from what was in the prior one, now those are different. I do believe that is a reason legally under the statute why you would have to update it. I still think it's a good idea under any circumstance. If any association out there has undergone or is undergoing a major project that shifts off schedule, or you've got change orders that drive the cost up, or you have to deal with something else you weren't anticipating, or you've got much more or much less money than you thought you would have, all of those are reasons to consider updating your reserve study. That's just, I think, best practice. You always want to be fine-tuning these documents, annually updating them, whether that's internally or using a provider, to make sure they are caught up, that they're incorporating all the latest information about the property. AJ's question is, yeah, everything I'm talking about today is for condos and co-ops that are 3 or more habitable stories. So this is not anything for HOAs or buildings that are less than 3 stories. Let's see. I said it, yeah, Lori's question at the beginning, I said there's a group of people this bill doesn't apply to. Yeah, I'm talking about, again, condos and co-ops that are governed under statute 718 or 719, which are 3 or more habitable stories and above. If you're in a property that does not meet that criteria, this class or this session was probably not for you. Okay. Brian's question, can SIRS reserves be kept in something like a Vanguard mutual fund? I think the answer is yes. I think the only thing it says in statute is that you've got to make prudent investment decisions. So if you work with a provider or an investment advisor and they recommend a mutual fund at Vanguard that's going to ensure, adequate liquidity and is, carefully considered for risk, I don't think there's anything in statute that prohibits that. But yeah, we'll be interested to see how this plays out in reality. Let's see. Mary Beth asks, is there a source that provides one document that includes all past bills, eliminating the changes that no longer apply instead of having to read each past bill? Yeah, so the good thing about each bill is that as they make a change, they will annotate it. They will cross out language that is no longer in effect. So really the most recent one that we're going to send to you, House Bill 913, you will see instances where old requirements have been removed or superseded with new information. So hopefully that helps. Otherwise, I guess, you could go to the Florida, government website and read, you could read prior ones, but you're better off just reading the most recent one, and hopefully that captures the changes as they go along. Let's see. Yes, copy of the webinar is going to get sent out with the follow-up email. Okay, our COAs, so condo associations under 3 habitable stories, still required to, lost it here, still required to have an updated and accurate reserve schedule, which is presented to owners with each annual budget. Yes, yes. So all condos, all co-ops, every single year have to prepare an annual budget, and every annual budget has to include an updated reserve schedule. Okay, so even though you're not subject to the SIRS requirement as a condo or an HOA or a co-op, you do need to prepare a new reserve schedule each year. All right, just in the interest of time, some of these we've already answered. I'm gonna skip over. You guys are great. You're asking lots of great questions. We don't have enough time to get through them all. Let me try to scan over the list, try to see if I can pick off at least a couple more. And if there's other questions that we don't get to today, my email address is up on the screen. I'll do my best to respond as quickly as I can. Let's see here. Okay, I like this one. How do you handle a SIRS budget when there is a mix of 2- and 4-story buildings? So Jan, good question there. My opinion on this is that you have one entity, right? You have one association, which may be comprised of buildings that are below the height requirement and above the height requirement for SIRS. To me, those are all still part of one financial entity. All of the owners, whether they live in a 2-story or a 4-story building, are paying into the same budget. And so our take on this is that you would treat the entire property as subject to the SIRS requirements, because it's one financial entity. If it happens to be a multi-condo where each building is a separate entity unto itself, then you would say, okay, we're just going to do the SIRS for the buildings that are 3 stories and above. But I just don't think it's practical. If you have 2- and 4-story buildings, but all of them are going to replace their roof at the same time, I would say that's important to be planning for that. And because some of them meet the SIRS requirement, our company's take is that all of them should plan as if they meet the requirement. Let's see. Elizabeth, good question here. She asks, long-lived items such as pipes and electrical, do we have to reserve for items longer than 50 years remaining life? So that's up to the discretion of the provider. So in the SIRS requirement, didn't talk about it specifically today, but in the requirement, it says there are 2 reasons why associations may not fund things in a SIRS, even though they're otherwise required. And that's if the replacement cost or the life expectancy is, cannot be defined, right? Something like the foundation of a building, the structure of a building should have an indeterminate useful life, or if the remaining life exceeds 25 years. So if we're dealing with a brand new building that, the pipes and the electrical should last well longer than 25 years, in cases like that, we are often not recommending reserves for those things yet. As the building ages, as those things become more commonplace, then we may add that in later on. But there are cases where you can avoid reserving for things that are longer than 25-year life, but that's up to the discretion of the provider. That's not a board decision.
Thanks for watching. For more great educational content, click the subscribe button now.